All right. In this lecture, we will learn how to style hyperlinks using pseudo-classes. But let's start by quickly fixing this red text here that we don't want. And actually what I will do here is to put this back to first child, which remember doesn't work. And then I will place a comment here using command or control slash. And then I will simply write that this is that misconception that we talked about in the last video. So this won't work. Okay, and so with this we are starting to document our code just a little bit. And so now I will actually add another comment here to say that here we will now be styling links or hyperlinks. Now we could think that this is how we style links. So we just write the A, so selecting all the anchor elements on the page, and then we could, for example, style their color. And let's say that we wanted to go with this same blue color here, and then as we reload it, actually these links look already nice. So this one turned blue, and these ones down here, and probably also these ones. Yeah, right. However, doing simply this is actually not a good practice. So we shouldn't simply select the anchor and then style it. Instead, we should style a pseudo class of the anchor, because that will then allow us to target different states. So the first one that we want to style is the link pseudo class. So this will basically target all the anchor elements that have an href attribute, because remember that we can actually specify anchors, so A elements, without the href attribute. And so they would then be targeted with the code that we had before, even though they are not really a link. But with this, so by specifying the link pseudo class, this will then only target actual links. So if we reload, it still looks nice. Let me actually show that to you very quickly. So here, if we had the color of red, and if I then specified an A element somewhere here, a test A, so that's somewhere here. And so you see that this one is now actually red. And so that's coming from this style here, but not from this. And again, that's because this one only targets A element that do actually have an href attribute, which this one does not. So let's get rid of it, and also of this rule here. And yeah, so now you know that this is how it should be done. Let's actually keep looking at these links here. Now another thing that's common to do when we style links is to get rid of the underline. So here is another CSS property to style text, which is text decoration, which we can set in this case to none. But there are a bunch of other values that I will show you in a second. But for now we just want to get rid of the underline, and so in these situations it's very common in multiple CSS properties to use the value of none. And indeed, now it's gone. And the same, of course, down here. Great. Next up, we have the visited pseudo class. So many sites actually display links differently if they have been clicked before. And one good example of that is Google. And in CSS, that would be really easy to do. All we had to do was to select the anchors with the visited pseudo class. So here we could then give them a different color, let's say like a light gray, something like this. Okay, but in practice, we never do that actually. So on normal pages, usually we always just give the visited links the same color as on the link pseudo class. So let's just do that and call it a day. And these two rules are actually now very similar, and so usually we actually group them together. But now let's not do that and keep everything just nicely separated, just for the purpose of learning here. Anyway, let's now go to our next pseudo class for anchors, which is the most important one, I would say, and that is hover. So in the hover pseudo class, we can define any styles that we want to be applied to the anchor as soon as the element is hovered by the mouse. So for example, let's say that in this situation, we wanted to change the color to something like orange-red, which is one of these color names that I actually like a little bit. And then let's say that we also wanted to change the font weight to bold. So kind of a bit of a crazy style here. And let's actually also bring back the underline. So text, decoration. And this one is another one of these shorthand properties where we can define multiple values. So in this case, we can define the text decoration line, text decoration style, and text decoration color. We can say underline. Then we can define the style of the underline, which is very similar to the style of the border. So let's say dotted, for example, and then finally the color. So let's set it also to orange-red. And let's see what now happens as we hover this link. And it worked. So the color changed, the font weight also changed, and also the text decoration. Let's try another one, like wavy, which is also fun. And that looks like this. So again, a little bit of a crazy style. And if we want it to be a bit less crazy, we can actually omit the second one, and CSS will then automatically figure out that the second one here is now the color. And so this looks a little bit more normal, right? And so let's keep it like this. Finally, we can also specify a fourth pseudo class. And this one is the active pseudo class. And this is the state in which we are actually clicking. So when we do actually click on a link, then the active pseudo class is added to the element, and we can then select that here like this. So just like we did with all these other four link states. So let's keep adding some crazy styles here, like setting the background color to black in those situations. And let's even make the font style italic. Okay, so that's it. And so the hover state looks the same, but now I'm going to click. And so this is what it looks like during the duration of the click. Now, if I move out here and let it go, then it goes back to the normal state. All right, and I think that's actually it. What matters here is that these four states are always defined in this exact order. So always link, visited, hover, and active. So that is, if it's easier to memorize for you, L, V, H, A. All right. But of course, we will keep doing this a couple more times throughout the rest of the course, and then things will become even easier for you. And now, with this, we actually reached the end of the very basics of some simple visual styling with CSS. Now, there is, of course, a lot of other visual stuff, like border radius, shadows, gradients, background images, and more, but we will leave that for a bit later. But for now, we will leave it at this point. And this is already great progress. So congratulations for making it this far and for already having learned all of this CSS. Next up, we will learn something about the browser, so a very helpful tool. And then we will, of course, keep learning CSS fundamentals by learning some theory and then learn some more properties that are related. And let's give ourselves some more space here to start. And now there are 3 ways to open up the developer tools. So first, you can right-click anywhere on the page and then click Inspect or Inspect Element. So these are the dev tools, But let me first show you two other ways. The second way is to come here to the View menu, then Developer, and then here Developer Tools. All right. Or the third way is a shortcut on the keyboard, and that is Option Command or Option Control on Windows I. All right. And then we will want to come here to the very first tab, which says Elements. Just make this a bit bigger so you can actually see it. All right. So the first thing that we can see here in the Elements tab is the exact HTML that we wrote in our HTML documents, right? So here we can open up each element by clicking on them, and then as we hover them, they actually get highlighted here on the page, which can be very helpful. So you see, for example, that our header is this entire box that we see highlighted here in blue, right? So that's this. Then the navigation is all this. And if we open it, then each of these links is just this very small box here. And they are sitting here side by side, as we can see, right? So that is the first thing that we can explore here. And then the second thing, and even more important, is the Style tab here on the left side. So here we can see all the styles that have been applied to a certain element. So let's go to the H1, for example, here. And then we can click it. And then here on the left side, all the styles that are currently applied to this element in our CSS file are displayed here. So we have this rule somewhere in our code, which sets the font to 26 and does all of this, right? Then we also have this rule somewhere which sets the color. And in fact, it is this one here, right? So this first one is this. Then here we get this one. And finally, there's also this one here, right? And so that is exactly this one. Okay. Now, maybe you had wondered before why the text here is actually bold in this H1 element. And the reason for that is basically the default style. So those default styles for the H1 are what are displayed here in this rule of the user agent style sheet. So that's just a fancy word for basically the default style. And down here, we can see that the font weight is set to bold by default. Okay, then this one here is something that we will learn about very soon. So don't worry about it for now. And then here, let's see, for example, these links. And so here is the code for them. So the CSS that we had applied to them already. So the color and the text decoration, right? But now what if we actually wanted to add some more styles here? So we could actually do that. So just for testing purposes, of course, we could now add a font size, let's say, of 30 pixels. And then immediately all the links on the page, so not just this one, but also this one and the other ones, all of them will now have the font size of 30 pixels. And to test that, we can then turn it on and off. And of course, we can also turn the other styles on and off simply by clicking here. All right. And of course, these values that we specify here, they will not affect the final website. So our code does not get changed if we do this. And we can prove that by very easily reload the page, and then everything is back to normal. All right. But let's actually explore links a little bit more, because there's something cool that we can do. So right now, there is only this CSS rule here applied. So only the one that has the link pseudo class. And that's because right now, the link is not being hovered or it's not active. And so therefore, the style for that does not apply. However, by clicking here, we can basically fake one of these states. So we can, for example, fake that the link is currently being hovered. So if we click here on hover, then you see that now this rule here is applying, because now A with the pseudo class hover does actually exist. So let's see that on the page, and the one that should have this state is the one that I actually have selected here. So this is the one that I selected, and so this is the one that now looks as if it is being hovered even though it is not. And so this is great, so we can test our web page without actually having to manually go there and hover over the links. Okay, of course we can do the same for this one here, and we could go ahead and search that here in the HTML tree, but I find it easier to simply right click on the element that I want and then inspect, and so that then automatically moves there. So if I click on hover now, then it automatically becomes hover even though it's not really. And the same, of course, for active. Right? So it's active, but we also want it to look like it's hovered at the same time, because usually when it's active, it is also hovered. But anyway, what matters is that now we have all these rules here applying in this moment. All right. But now let's turn it off again. And yeah, I think that's actually all I had to show you at this point. So we're going to use the dev tools all the time throughout the rest of the course, because these are absolutely essential to create a website in an efficient way. So I was actually really excited when I found out myself about these tools, and I hope you like them as well, and that you maybe go ahead and experiment around a little bit with this now. So you can just click on any element that you'd like and experiment maybe a little bit with turning these styles on and off, maybe adding some other ones, and really analyzing a bit what happens here with all these different rules being applied. So have some fun with that, and I see you soon in an. So here is an example that is similar to the code that we wrote in our project. So it's the author paragraph that we have somewhere in the code, but here we have one ID called author text and one class called author. And then on the right side, we have three rules that are actually applied to this element. So as we can clearly see, all of these three different selectors, and therefore all of these three rules, all select the same element. And so now the big question is, which of these rules applies? Well, the answer to that is actually that all of them apply. So all rules and all the properties that are in the rules are applied to this element. However, if we take a close look, we can see that there are conflicting font size declarations, right? So in the first one, it says the font size should be 18, then 20 pixels, and then 22 pixels. So which of those is it going to be? Will it be 18, 20, or 22 pixels? Well, let's learn what rules CSS applies in order to resolve conflicting declarations like this one. So when there are multiple declarations for the exact same element, such as we have here in our example, then what matters are the selectors. So the highest priority for now are the ID selectors. So that means if there is any ID selector, then that is the rule that is going to be applied. Now, if there are multiple ID selectors, then it is the list of those selectors that gets applied. Now, in reality, it is actually a bit more complicated than this. So there are a lot of concepts involved, such as the cascade and selector specificity, but you don't need to know about these details for now as a beginner. So I think that the amount of information that I will give you in this slide should be enough for you to resolve your own conflicts in your own CSS code. All right, but anyway, in case there is no ID selector, then the next in the priority is a class or a pseudo class selector. And again, if there are multiple of one of those, then it is the last selector of those in the code that gets applied. Then the next is the element selector. So in case there is no ID selector or no class selector, then it is the element selector that gets applied. And again, if there are multiple, it is the last one of those. Finally, there's also something called the universal selector, but a bit more about that in the next lecture. What matters is that the universal selector is the one with the lowest priority of all. Alright? But now, going back to our example and taking into consideration the rules that we have here, we should now be able to resolve the conflict that we have here. So we have a class selector, then we have an ID selector, and then we have an element selector, right? So, based on the rules that we just learned here, it is the ID selector with the ID of author text that will decide the font size of this element. So, for the conflicting font size property, it is this ID selector that actually gets applied. But keep in mind that the font style, font family, and the color from all the other selectors still applies, right? So that's what I mentioned in the last slide. So if we have multiple rules, so multiple selectors that select the same element, then all of those rules apply. So these rules here are only for resolving the conflicting properties such as the font size in this case, because again, the font size is present in all the three rules that are applying right now to our author element. All right, and these are the most important rules that you need to know to resolve conflicting declarations, but just for the sake of completeness, there are actually things that have a higher priority than the ID selector. So one of those things is inline styles. So remember that we declare inline styles by using the style attribute in HTML. Now, since we shouldn't actually do this anyway, this is not really important. But you should still know that these styles actually have priority over the styles that are declared using an ID selector. Then, with the highest priority, we have declarations marked with the important keyword. And the important keyword is basically just a hack that you can use as a last resort to resolve conflicts in your CSS. But this should usually not be used. So, as I mentioned, it should only be as a last resort. But what matters is that this really is the highest priority that can exist. Whenever we mark a declaration with important, it is the one that will be applied. Okay, and with all that being said, let's now jump back into our code and actually see this in practice. And let's create a very simple example with this paragraph that is in the footer. So right now here we have added the ID of copyright, but let's now also add a class to it. So just to create a kind of similar example to what we had in the slide. So here I'm adding a class of copyright. So a class can have the exact same name as the ID. That's not a problem at all. And now I will do something that we actually didn't do before, which is to add another class. So we can actually add multiple classes, and all we have to do is to just add a space. So I will also add the class of text. And so now this one has both the class of copyright and of text. All right. So we will be able to select the element using both of them. So let's try to do that here at the end. I will just add another comment here, resolving conflicts. So let's try to add some different colors to this text. So here I'm going to say copyright and set it to red. Then copyright the class, set it here to blue. Then the class of text, set it to yellow here. And finally, I'm also going to select it using elements. So I will use the descendant selector here, footer, and then P. So I will simply select the P element that's inside of the footer. But keep in mind that these are still elements. And so here I will apply the green color. So right now we have these 4 rules, and so these 4 selectors that are applying to that element. So which color do you think the text will have? Well, let's see. And indeed, it is red. And so that's because we have an ID selector here. And the ID selector has a higher priority than, for example, this one here, or this one, or this one, because these are class selectors and these are element selectors. Actually, VS Code helps us resolving this conflict, by the way. So if we hover over this, we have this hint which says selector specificity. And so there we have a 1 in the very first position. And here in the class, we have a 1 in the second position. And here in the element, we have a 2, but that doesn't matter. So it's just a number in the third position. And so the first position is the one that has the highest priority, the second has the second highest priority, and then the elements. Okay? Now, again, there are some more rules here. For example, the reason behind why there is a 2, but let's not focus on that for now. All right. What matters is that this is an ID, and therefore it is the red color that applies now. We can also see that here in the inspector, so in the DevTools. So if I inspect this element here, then you see that we need some more space here. But what you also see is that we have this copyright here. So that's this one. We also have this other one which comes from before for the font size. And so here now both of them apply. And then we also have these other 3. So these 3 rules are also here. And you see that all of them here are basically crossed out, right? So they have this strike through, which means that they are not being applied. Okay. Now, what happened if this one here did not exist? So if we turned this one here off, basically, so that would be the same as deleting this code. And so what do you think would happen then? So in that case, we have 2 class selectors and 1 element selector. So try to make your guess, and then let's try to either remove this code or to uncheck this box. And yeah, the text turned yellow. And the reason for that is that now we have these 2 selectors with the same hierarchy, so with the same priority, and then in that situation, it is the last one that applies. And so that is this one. Right? Now, if we turn that one off, then of course it would be blue. And finally, only then, if none of these 3 existed, then the text would become green. So I hope that made sense. And let's actually analyze some more situations here. So, for example, this element here, I think it has a class, or actually an ID. So yeah, it has an author ID, and of course it also has this element selector which applies to all the paragraphs. And so here we have the conflicting font size, and yeah, basically that's the example that we studied in the slide, right? So this one here is pretty obvious. Then let's check out this H1 here, because here we have a lot of rules that are applying. But in fact, they don't seem to be conflicting, or actually they are conflicting. So here the color is supposed to be this gray, and then here it is supposed to be this blue. So let's go up where this actually happens. And so, yeah, it is these 3 rules here that are applying, right? But all of them are only element selectors. So there's no IDs and no classes. And so therefore, the reason why the color is actually blue and not gray is because this selector here appears last in the code. If we put this one first, then you would see that the text would indeed become gray. Okay, but let's put that back. Okay, and now just one final example with the links. So let's move down here. And remember also how we said in the slide how these pseudoclasses actually also have priority over elements. And so even if we put like this here, so if we selected the anchors simply by doing this without any pseudoclass, let's say color red once again, then the reason why this does not have any effect on the links is because this one has a higher priority because it does have the pseudoclass in the selector and this one does not, right? And so if we now select this here, then you will see that both of these rules do apply, but the color, as I just mentioned, will of course come from this one. And again, that's because this one here does have the pseudoclass, while this one is very simply a element selector. Okay, and yeah, this is what you need to know for now. We will encounter some of these situations later on as we go through the course, and by then I will explain a little bit more about this. But for now, this is all I wanted you to know about this topic, which can be quite confusing for beginners when they start writing their own CSS code, and then the rules start conflicting, and then they do not really understand what is happening. So I think that this is important, and so hopefully you liked this video and found it useful. Oh, and just one final thing that I actually wanted to show you before I leave you with this is the important keyword. So remember how the important keyword makes a declaration more important basically than all the other ones. So let's come back down here, inspect it, and of course, as we already saw, this selector here, so this one, is the one with the lowest priority of all because it's just an element selector. But if we now add the important keyword here like this, so exclamation mark important, then all of a sudden the text will become green, right? So just as you can see it here. But again, this is more of a hack that you should not be using usually. Just in case you really cannot figure out what's happening in your code. But even then, instead of using the important keyword, what you should probably do is to write simpler selectors. So this is also an important rule and an important takeaway that you should take from this lecture. So always write your selectors as simple as possible and do not add too much nesting, or don't add too many IDs and classes all in the... And actually, we already saw inheritance in action before. So remember back at the beginning of this section, I mentioned that, for example, this element here, so this Laura Jones, which is a strong element, still gets the styles of the paragraph element inside of which it is located, right? So let's inspect this element here. And so, of course, it is a strong element. And so as a default style, and so that's the user agent style sheet, remember. So as a default, it gets the font weight of bold, right? But then here we see that also it gets inherited from the paragraph. So from its parent element. So here it gets the italic, the 18 pixels of a font size, and also the line height of 1.5. And so basically what this means is that inheritance is a mechanism by which some styles, so some properties, get their values inherited from parent elements to child elements. And so let's now use this in a big way by setting some styles onto the body element. So we use the body elements to set some styles because the body element is the parent element of all the other elements in our HTML document. And so if we set certain properties in the body, then their values will get inherited to all of their child elements. Now, not all properties do actually get inherited. It is mostly the ones that are about text. So let's start with a very simple one. So the color, and let's set the color to red. Now, what do you think is going to happen in this situation, given that we actually set the color on most of these elements here already down here? Well, let's see. And so as we reload, nothing really changed here. And the reason for that is that while this red color still got inherited, this color property right here in this rule did override the inherited style. Okay, so the inherited styles are easily overwritten whenever there is any rule that applies for the same property. So an inherited property is very easily overwritten by any rule which has a value for that same property. So in a sense, we can say that inherited values are the ones who have the lowest priority. But anyway, if we now removed the color from here, and let's just comment it out, then, well, all the text which does not have a color declared will become red. So this one here, all of this. Now this one is still blue because we're overriding it here, right? But then everything else is red. And so now what we can do is to set the text color that we're actually interested in here in the body. And so now all the text is gray such as before, but all we have to do is to declare that value in the body, and then this value 444 gets inherited for the color for all of the rules which do not have a color declaration. And now let's actually do the same with the font family. So I will actually cut it from here and paste it here. The same for this one. And so once again, all the elements got the sans serif value here inherited for the font family property. All right. And actually, if we go back here one step, so I'm just putting it back. So you see that here the links, they're actually still in the serif style, because nowhere in our code we added the font family of sans serif to them, right? So now I'm doing it again here, pasting it here, and take a look what happens now. And you see now they are just like the rest of the text in sans serif. And so actually we no longer need this selector here. We can just get rid of it. And just to be sure, I really want to clarify something here one more time. So this is really elements inheriting values for certain properties from one another. So this is not conflicting selectors. Or in other words, this body selector here is not selecting all of these elements. Okay? It does not apply to all the elements. Instead, what we do is to declare values for these properties here, such as color and font family, and then they simply get passed down to all the child elements that are contained within the body. And so that's why we use the technique of putting these properties that are related to text into the body. Okay? Because these are the ones that we then want all of the elements on the page to have. Now, as I said before, many styles do actually not get inherited, because that would be very impractical for most of the properties. For example, let's say border top. So if we declare a border top of 10 pixels and solid with our blue color to the body, let's see what happens then. And indeed, it simply added this blue border to the top of our body element, but it did not do so to all of the child elements, right? Because again, that would be very, very impractical. And now let's take a quick look at a graphical representation of inheritance to really make it crystal clear. So here we have a very simple example of a web page which simply contains a navigation, an H1, and a P element. And on the right side, we also have some styles for the body element. And in particular, the color, font size, font family, and border top. Now, of course, the body element here is the parent element of all these other three elements. And so, therefore, thanks to inheritance, all of these three elements basically get access to these three properties that are inherited. And again, all these three properties are basically related to text, while on the other hand, the border property does not get inherited. So not all of the properties do get inherited, but it is mostly the ones related to text. And I have a big list of many of the properties that do get inherited, so you can take a look at them if you'd like. But anyway, let's now say that we also have a rule for the h1 element. And so it declares basically a new color and a new font size. So it's bigger and it is blue. And so what happens now is that these two declarations do actually override the inherited styles. Therefore, for the h1, the color is no longer gray and the font size is no longer 16 pixels. But instead, it is now blue and 32 pixels. So this is a visual representation of inheritance in action, which I hope makes it a little bit more clear so that you can really understand how it works. So maybe take some more time looking at this and studying this example a little bit more, and then we will actually get one more time back to our code. And what I want to show you now is that inheritance actually also works on a much smaller scale, which is something that we also do all the time. So inheritance is not only helpful by putting styles into the body, but also in other situations. So let's say that we wanted to change the size of these 4 links here. That would actually be very easy. All we would have to do is to, let's go there. So would be to put a class on them and then select these links based on the class, right? Or we could also do something like this. So we could do nav and then select the A elements in there with the pseudo class of link, right? Let's say we wanted the font size to be 18 pixels. And so you see that that actually worked. But now let's say that we, for some reason, also had a paragraph in here saying this is the navigation. And so this is now probably 22 pixels big. Let's see. Yeah, because that's the default that we set for the paragraphs. But we also want this to be 18 pixels, just like everything here in our navigation. So how could we do that? Well, of course, we could add that here like this, and it would work again, right? But we could also do it in a much better way. So we don't need all of this. All we need to do is to say nav and then set the font size to 18 pixels in here, and then all of the rest should inherit those styles. Now, actually the paragraph here does not inherit it because we specifically set a font size of 22 for the paragraphs already. So that might not be such a good example. Let's use a strong element here. Okay, and so now this should be 18 pixels just as specified here. So if we took this back, then let's see what we got there. All right, so nothing really. But now if this was here turned on, so if we set the font size in the navigation to 18 pixels, then now we could see that the strong element here got the 18 pixels inherited from nav. Okay, and so now everything here is 18 pixels, and that's thanks to inheritance. Okay, so this is a technique that we use all the time, but let's now actually get rid of the strong here. And again, I can actually comment out this code just like we did in CSS before, by hitting Command or Control/. All right. And now, just to finish, there is actually another way of adding some styles to all of the elements. So let's go back up here actually, and I will put it here. And what I'm talking about is the universal selector that I mentioned in the slide about conflicting selectors. So basically, the universal selector simply selects every single element on the page. And so this is useful if we actually want a certain property applied to all elements, but which does not get inherited. So, for example, the color we want on all the elements, but the color gets inherited. And so we can simply put it here in the body, right? However, now imagine that we wanted the border top on all the elements. So this, for example, we could paste this here, and as we reload, we would get this beautiful result. So you see every single element, and that includes like the EM here and the strong. So all of them now have this border top, right? So not really helpful, but it helps demonstrate that we really can apply a certain style to every single element on the page. Just keep in mind that this selector is actually the one with the lowest priority. So it would be very easy to simply override this. Okay, let's say that here we had red on the body, and then this one would be red, and only all the other ones would be blue. And again, because this is an element selector, and so it has a higher priority than the universal selector. But let's put it back, and actually let's turn this one off right here. So the universal selector is actually quite important. For now, we don't have a big use case for it yet, but we will soon, and then I will explain it a little bit more. But for now, what I want you to understand is that there is a big difference between the universal selector and the body selector. So the universal selector simply applies to all the elements, and there is no inheritance involved. And therefore, this is perfect if you want to apply a certain property that does not automatically get inherited to all the elements. On the other hand, any style that we put here in the body gets inherited. And so that's simply a completely different mechanism than using the universal selector. The same selector, okay? So I will leave that here for you, but I will comment it out so that it does not apply. And actually, we don't need any of this. Let me put it back on, and I will comment all of this.